It's been just under a month since President Trump took office for his second term, and his administration is taking shape. This week, Tulsi Gabbard was confirmed by the Senate as the Director of National Intelligence, while Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was confirmed as Health and Human Services Secretary. Trump has announced big changes this week, including making himself the chair of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., eliminating paper straws, and establishing the White House Faith Office. And other elections are just around the corner in the country ahead of 2025 and 2026. It's a busy time, and we want to check in to see how Americans are feeling all about it. To break it all down, we're going to go on the record with Scott Tranter, the Director of Data Science for Decision Desk HQ. Scott, it's great to see you. I want to kick off with one poll we saw: tough, energetic, focused, effective. Those are all words that Americans have used to describe Trump, according to a CBS News YouGov poll. Clearly, he's been making waves, and Americans have opinions about that. 53% of Americans say they approve of his job performance. 47% say they disapprove. What should we make about all of that? We see these approval ratings coming out each week. How much do they ultimately matter?
Well, I think they matter a lot because it drives the narrative, especially given, some of the Donald Trump's detractors coming into office thought that immediately he'd be proven unpopular. I think this is interesting that CBS YouGov poll is something that we've been tracking here for several years now, and they're consistent in it. And that 6-point movement, that's significant. That's considerably higher than it was last time. There's been other polls that come around it that also show he's above water 50%. Look, it's still early. We're about 3 weeks in. A lot can change, but the first 3 weeks, these polls, they're measuring public sentiment accurately, and initially the public likes what they're seeing.
I want to go to a campaign issue that Trump talked quite a bit about on the trail, and that's inflation and rising prices. We've actually seen inflation accelerate last month, rising to 3.3%. Egg prices are soaring, jumping the most in over 10 years. Trump obviously made lowering prices for Americans a key part of that campaign. In that same CBS YouGov poll, we saw that 66% said Trump's focus on lowering prices is not enough, 31% said the right amount, and 3% said too much. What steps could we see the Trump administration take to lowering living costs for Americans?
Yeah, look, it's obviously, as you point out with those numbers, it's very important. Donald Trump just tweeted out or X'd out the last couple of days, he wants the Fed to lower rates. Things like that. He believes, if they lower rates and maybe mortgages will be a little bit cheaper, credit card balance will be a little cheaper. This is obviously something Americans think about, or Americans are concerned about. It'll be interesting to see how that squares with some of the tariff calls that the president has gone for, which will immediately, even if all the costs aren't passed on, some of the costs will be passed on in a lot of these goods and services. So, look, I think the public is generally liking what they see in the first 2 or 3 weeks, and they're going to give him a little bit more time to see if some of these policies play out, to see if things like mortgages, things like eggs, things like, rent come down over the next couple months.
I want to turn our attention to a new Gallup poll that found that 5 of the living former presidents, it shows Barack Obama received the highest favorable rating at 59%. I believe this is at the point when they left office. Joe Biden received the lowest at 39%. In the middle, we see Donald Trump at 48%. How have Americans trended over time when it comes to their approval ratings with these presidents? Does the public perceive their approval of a president differently during or after their term?
Yes, they do. And I just look at that George W. Bush number, 52%. Julia, I think we're probably going to age ourselves a little bit here, but we were relatively young when George W. Bush was running for his second term, and he wasn't anywhere. He's probably one of the most unpopular presidents since the Vietnam War. So that 52% shows you kind of what happens. I think Joe Biden expects that to happen to him as well. Give it 10, 15, 20 years for people to look back on it. I think that surprising number is that Donald Trump, 48%. Theoretically, that's probably going to go higher. So, when he gets out of office. So that's an interesting point there, especially compared to where Bill Clinton is.
Absolutely. Speaking of previous White House officials, former Vice President Kamala Harris has emerged as a Democratic frontrunner for California governor. Let's note that she has not announced a run, and we don't know whether she will run or not, but that's according to an Emerson College poll. That poll found that 57% of Democratic primary voters in the state said that they would would support her if she ran for governor. 17% said they are undecided. The rest said someone else. I got to say, Scott, talking to California operatives, though, they say, that this is still up in the air. They want to caution, any speculation on these polls. But what can we glean from this? We're seeing other California Democrats sort of, looking at jumping into the race.
I think we can glean from being from California myself. Look, that's a name ID poll, right? When you throw some names out there, especially some of those names on there, unless you're in California politics, you probably don't have a real good idea who Katie Porter is, or even Antonio Villaraigosa, especially if you're in Northern California. So I think we're looking at what name ID is. I happen to agree that if she gets in, and if some of those names actually start campaigning, they're going to raise some money, and that's going to be a tougher primary than that poll indicates. That's for sure.
I want to turn to the Senate. The Cook Political Report found that Republicans have an advantage in the 2026 races. The ratings showed the GOP having a relatively strong position to maintain its majority, listed the toss-up Senate seats as Georgia and Michigan. Both of them are currently held as Democrats. But Scott, earlier today, Minnesota Senator Tina Smith said she would not seek re-election. And you have NRSC chairman, the Senate campaign arm chair, Tim Scott, saying Minnesota is in play. So how does this all bode going into 2026?
Yeah, it's not a good announcement for the Democrats. Look, that is a seat that they didn't think they'd have to defend. I think depending on who the candidate is on the Republican side and depending on who the candidate is on the Democratic side, it's probably a lean Democratic seat initially. But don't take that as a good thing for the Democrats. The fact that, I'm saying it's candidate dependent just tells you how close Minnesota has gotten over the years. And, look, the Republicans are going to have plenty of money, and that's just another seat. They don't have to win it, but if they do, it's an opportunity for them to expand their majority.
I want to shift gears. The Department of Justice directed federal prosecutors to dismiss the corruption case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Last week, we reported that Adams is polling more than 20 points behind former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo in the mayoral race. Cuomo still has not announced if he will run or not. What does this mean for the election if he gets sort of a pass from the DOJ?
It means that he's got a free shot to potentially win that primary and be mayor again. I found it interesting that an aide also said he hasn't completely ruled out switching parties to the GOP. Look, New York City politics never fails to amaze. Anthony Weiner, Andrew Cuomo, Bloomberg, all these other folks, de Blasio. Look, Eric Adams is doing what he needs to survive. And I think Andrew Cuomo is doing what he needs to do to stay politically relevant. So we'll see how this plays out, but it'll be an interesting primary to watch. That's for sure.
You're so right. New York City politics, New York State politics, never boring. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.